Mother is the name for God in the lips and hearts of all children. The Crow was a movie that you cannot remake. You can't. It's not possible. And I'm going to tell you why. Because I watched Jeremy at the Quartering and a couple other people stumble through these explanations, these reviews of the trailer. We watched the trailer. This is not a high-tech video where I'm going to be watching the trailer for you. This is just me putting this out there. Other people, I included Jeremy in the Quartering because I watched his video and I remember him saying like, well, I watched it once and I wasn't a big fan and maybe I'll watch it again. I don't know how old he was when the original Crow came out, but I was a teenager when the Crow came out and I absolutely loved that movie along with a whole bunch of other people who were absolutely obsessed with that movie. I saw it in the theater as quickly as I could. I went out and bought the VHS as soon as I could. I wore it out over the years. Like, we loved this movie. And I'm going to tell you exactly why. You can't remake it. It can't be remade, along with a whole bunch of other 80s and 90s films that cannot be remade. All right? In 1989, a comic book called The Crow by James O'Barr came out. Before we get started, really, I'm not a huge fan of the comic. Some panels of the comic were really well done. There's some artwork in it that I like. It was beautiful. And there's a vast majority of it that I didn't think was drawn very well, or it didn't sync with me. I just didn't like it that much. No offense to Mr. O'Barr. It was a really creative work. It was great. I thought the pacing of it was off. I thought the movie The Crow actually corrected a lot of pacing issues that I had with the comic book. For instance, and I'm getting ahead of myself, the comic book scene where he walks into the boardroom and fights all these guys was actually kind of at the beginning of the comic book. And then he goes and he takes care of all the guys that weren't there. So they kind of reversed that in the movie, and I thought that was a good pacing decision. But let's back up. In 1989, this comic book comes out. In 1993, as they're filming this movie based on this comic, Brandon Lee, the son of Bruce Lee, which is why we all liked him, okay? He was in Rapid Fire. He was in Showdown Little Tokyo with Dolph Lundgren. Like, he had two really good action movies under his belt. And then we're hearing about, he's going to film this new movie, The Crow. And we're all excited. It's going to be awesome. Okay? Because if you grew up in that time period in the 70s and 80s, Bruce Lee was the man. You watched all of his films, okay? And you had a pair of nunchucks just to see if you could do half of what he did, which you couldn't, and it hurt your head. Okay? And here's his son, who actually knows martial arts, all right? And actually wants to be an actor and can actually do these moves in this movie that he's doing, which is a thing that back then was a big deal. Like Arnold Schwarzenegger. These guys actually looked like they were. They weren't like Jason Momoa, who everybody loves, who admittedly, he doesn't go into a gym unless the studios are paying him to go into a gym, okay? I miss the old, what you see was what you got. Arnold was actually a big, strong guy. He didn't do it for the movies. That's who he was. That's who Sylvester Stallone was, all right? Brandon Lee was a martial artist and he was in good shape. We like that about actors, okay? That they had some integrity about them. They didn't just do things for the movies. And we liked that the movies went out and found people who actually fit the bill for what they were looking for. It was a whole different time period that most young people can't understand. They won't understand. And I don't understand them, and that's okay. We were raised differently. We were raised in different time periods. But you cannot understand why The Crow can't be remade because nobody's explained it to you. I'm here to do that. In 1993, a movie came out. It's called Dragon, the Bruce Lee story, where Jason Lee, who's not related, played Bruce Lee. And in that movie, those of us who didn't really live through Bruce Lee's life got to see Bruce Lee's life, and we got to see the birth, the 1965 birth of Brandon. All right? We got to see it as close as we could. We got to see it recreated in a movie. This actor who was the son of another famous actor who we all loved. who we're now watching movies from, who's like one of our heroes, okay? And he's got another movie coming out. So we saw The Crow. And it looked as close to the comic as it possibly could. Brandon Lee didn't look exactly like the Crow in the story. We were willing to forgive that because he did such a good job with it. And he did look very convincing like Eric Draven, like this character. Okay? He made it his own. It was very special. Every scene in the movie, in the 1994 movie The Crow, with no exceptions that I can think of, are drawn from the comic. Okay? They did not step outside the bounds. They were as faithful to the comic as they could while keeping it to a 2-hour movie production. We all loved it. This kid who we'd grown up with, whose dad we'd grown up with. Right? And they made it into a movie, and the movie was this gray. The whole thing was dark. It was gray. It looked like the comic. It was so stylized. And the music was wonderful. And for that time period, you were living through a time period where the music was absolutely on point. Okay? The whole soundtrack was amazing. Leaned very heavily into metal, which I don't mind. You don't have that kind of environment today to make this movie, especially based on this comic book. So I watched the trailer, and I wish that I could pluck Bill Skarsgård out of this whole thing and leave him aside, because Bill Skarsgård is an excellent actor. He's been great in every single thing I've seen him in. Okay, so I feel like he's gonna be good in this movie because he's Bill Skarsgård. Okay. Other than that, the trailer alone looks awful. It doesn't look a thing like the comics. There's these giant, panoramic, sweeping images that doesn't fit. That's not what the comic book looked like. There is no guide. I noticed there's this black gentleman who's leading him through the underworld at some point, or at least that's what it looks like. That didn't exist. It wasn't in the comics. Okay? I don't know what's up with the tattoos, why he looks like the Joker. I don't know whose stylistic decision that was. I don't really care. It doesn't look like The Crow. It doesn't look like the comic. And I understand that we want to have a more diverse audience, whatnot. I don't understand the race swapping of Shelley. Shelley in the comics is very specifically a white blonde woman who lives in a dilapidated city. For the movie they chose Detroit. I don't remember in the comic that it was particularly Detroit, although it looks a lot like Detroit. I don't think they ever specified this is Detroit, but Detroit's real fitting, especially the way they portrayed it in the movie. Okay? And it's not like this movie needed any more diversity. You had Ernie Hudson. You had the guy from Hackers that I can't remember the name of. All right? We all love that guy, okay, as Tintin. You had the female police officer who was the wife of Ernie Hudson's character. You had diversity in this movie. You had the Asian lead in the villain female. You didn't need any more diversity in this film. You can't make it more diverse in some way without absolutely ruining the story. Okay? The movie was completely unique. There was nothing like it before The Crow. Before 1994, there was no movie like this. And there has never been one made like it since. Okay? And Brandon Lee and his tragic death during that film is a memory that the guys at my age who watch this movie, we don't get over. All right? He was born in 65. Brad Pitt was born in 63. Do you know what kind of star Brandon Lee would be right now if he hadn't been killed in that film? Okay? Imagine Fight Club, but Brandon Lee's alive to play the character. Okay? Imagine any action movie that somebody else did in that time that he could be in. He would have been amazing to this day. We all look forward to that. Okay? and The Crow is his last film, you can't remake that moment. You can't remake this thing. And you certainly can't remake it as a remake of a movie, which is what they seem to be doing. They seem to be going, let's remake the movie. Not let's adapt the comic book again. Let's remake the movie, which is not the same thing. Because I watched the trailer and I see absolutely no parallels between the comic book and the movie. It looks like they just made something up. Which brings me to my farther point, okay? Why is this generation coming up of directors and artists, why are they so creatively bankrupt, okay? The 80s and 90s were a plethora of unique movies that cannot be remade and should not be remade. And while I'm at that, let's talk about the new Roadhouse, which I don't care about, okay? You can remake Roadhouse until you're blue in the face. You should, in fact, you should. There should be a Roadhouse every decade. There should be a new Roadhouse with new actors. You know why? Because it wasn't a unique film. It was entertaining. It was funny, all right? I loved Sam Elliott in that movie. I thought it was great. But it's not something that was so unique to its time that it can't be remade. You can remake Roadhouse till you're blue in the face, all right? I don't care. You can't remake The Crow. You cannot remake the original Ghostbusters. You cannot remake the original Lost Boys. You cannot remake Fight Club. You can't remake Cool World. You can't remake 7 or 12 Monkeys. These are movies you cannot remake. They were too unique, and any attempt to remake them makes you look like a creatively and morally bankrupt shill with no talent.